great to be here tonight. And I think one of the things I want to start with is Jeff talked about is reform. And I know it would be easy to be negative about the reform agenda. There's been some setbacks recently in some of the work that's being done. But I hope by the end of this speech tonight, you'll at least feel a bit encouraged about the area of transport. And hopefully the minister won't throw bread rolls at me when we go through this as well. So let me jump right into it, and we have a lot to discuss tonight. I think you'll find it interesting. So let me start with this graph here. We have some of the world's most congested cities and leading cities in the world. So population is there on the x-axis, and we have a congestion level on the y-axis. So we look at Moscow right at the top. It has a rating of 74%. And what that means is that motorists in Moscow spend 74% more time in traffic than they would do if the traffic was free-flowing. And the next dot we're going to light up here is Beijing. And Beijing, just a few years back, had a traffic jam stretching for 100 kilometers, and it lasted for more than a week. And if you remember the press, it was dubbed at the time the Great Crawl of China. And Beijing has a congestion rating of 43%. And then we have cities like London, LA, and Rome, all big cities with predictably high congestion levels, and they're all around the 30% mark. So you're probably wondering, and our cities aren't up there yet, how do our major capital cities compare? So let's start with Sydney. It has a rating of 34%. So it is right up there with the same size or congestion levels as London and LA. Now, we've all been to these cities. We know how congested London and LA are. Sydney's up there at the same levels, but those cities are 3 times the size of Sydney. And Melbourne's not far behind with a rating of 27%, which means it actually tops New York at 26% from a congestion level. And Brisbane's not far behind at 23%. Now, I don't think a lot of you in this room will be surprised about this, because years now, IPA and others have talked about how Australia is underinvested in infrastructure. And obviously, we're seeing the consequences of this, and they're manifest in the traffic congestion in our cities. And we often try to quantify this problem by talking about these epic statistics. So we talk about a $700 billion infrastructure backlog. We talk about road congestion pricing costing $15 billion a year, and projected to increase to $20 billion a year in productivity loss by 2020. We have other things like escalating road maintenance costs that in New South Wales alone is costing $300 per person annually. So again, when we look at these kind of results, we agree that our transport funding model does not generate anywhere near the kind of income levels that we need to address these issues. Now, the magnitude of these issues is not lost on Australians either, because they well understand that our transport networks are failing their needs and their expectations. Now, late last year, we engaged an independent study research firm to survey residents in Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne about infrastructure and funding. And when we asked them what issues required government leadership and action, road infrastructure and reducing congestion came second only to healthcare. Road infrastructure ranked ahead of issues such as education, growing the economy, and substance abuse. Now, 98% of respondents found traffic congestion in their city concerning, while 42% found it very concerning. And 65% wanted more road infrastructure, and only 1 in 5 were happy with the pace of new development. Pretty graphic statistics, but why aren't Australians demanding a solution to address what they already know is a very significant issue? Now, I would argue that the stats and the numbers we talk about, they don't resonate with the public. So what does a $700 billion infrastructure backlog mean to a mom and dad who just need to get their kids to a football game? Or what does it mean to a tradesperson who needs to get to a job urgently, or the commuter who is spending hours a week in traffic for a journey that takes only 20 minutes in an off-peak period? There is clearly a lack of understanding between the current funding methods and the current deterioration, or the continuing deterioration, in our transport system. So we need to connect with Australians in a matter that matters to them personally. and clearly demonstrate the imperatives of finding a sustainable funding solution. And the solution matters, and this is the key to tonight, and the key, I think, why we need to have this discussion, because it goes and strikes to the heart of the quality of our life we're going to lead, and the quality of life we want our kids to lead. Because we cannot afford this benign acceptance that this is just the way big cities perform, because all the while our quality of life is continuing to be eroded. We are living the boiled frog syndrome as we are accepting ever-increasing congestion. And finding a solution is about ensuring our capital cities maintain their status as the most livable in the world. So every year when The Economist releases the City Livability Index, Sydney and Melbourne constantly rank in the top 10. And we're all very proud of it, and we talk about it. Brisbane's up there in the top 20. And Melbourne has been number 1 for the past 4 years. But how realistic is this ranking when transport infrastructure accounts for under 6% of the total score? To me, the weighting seems incredibly low given the urban sprawl of our Australian cities and our reliance on our transport networks. Because we can look at a different index which gives a greater weighting to transport, and you can see a very different result. Now, I'll take, for example, Brussels here, which in 2009 was ranked as 14th in the world in the terms of livability, but by the Mercer Index. But by 2012, it had fallen to 22nd, due in large part to congestion and ineffective transport infrastructure. Now, Brussels is now consistently ranked one of the most congested cities in Western Europe, and Belgians waste 98 hours a year in traffic. If I go back to that first chart that we talked about, it's hardly surprising that Sydney is actually not far behind. So motorists spend 89 hours a year on average in congestion in Sydney, while in Melbourne we're sitting in traffic for 76 hours. Let me put these hours into perspective for you. You could watch your football team play every round next season for the time the average driver is sitting in congestion, and you would still have time to spare. You could read your child the entire Harry Potter series, or you could watch all 8 movies 4 times over. And my favorite is you would not have to listen to talkback radio for 89 hours during the morning peak. Now, I didn't insert anyone's name there because I'm nervous about that. But so what really does this mean for our city's livability if we don't take action? Melbourne's population is forecast to almost double to around 8 million by 2050. And Sydney is expected to grow to a similar size number. Now compare our city's growth to their global peers, and that starkly puts our challenges into context. If we look at the forecast population growth over the next 30 years in America's biggest cities, New York is expected to grow by 8%, Los Angeles by 12%, and Chicago by 16%. So we're talking about a fraction of the growth we're expecting in our major cities, and that's both on a percentage basis as well as quantum. So you can imagine what this is going to do to our livability unless we invest in infrastructure. Our congestion levels are currently similar to these major US cities, but our populations are going to double in the next 35 years. Now we can see the same patterns looking back over the past 50 years. Sydney's population at that time has almost doubled, while in comparison, London this year finally surpassed the population it had just before World War II. Now, while the two cities have very different needs that draw upon various modes of transport, it's interesting to compare the investment in their passenger train networks over the last 70 years. As you can see from the London map, it's had huge development with numerous line expansions, including the Victoria Line and almost 50 new underground stations. On the other hand, if we look at the Sydney network map, it hasn't changed much in 70 years, despite a doubling of the population. Now, London continues to invest heavily in its network. They've got the Crossrail line under construction, which will carry 200 million passengers a year and increase the rail network capacity by 10%. Now, in Sydney, we do have 2 long overdue rail lines scheduled to open in the next few years, and we thank the Minister for Transport for pushing that, and we know she has very ambitious plans on increasing the rail network going forward, and we applaud that. And these rail developments and our committed road projects in New South Wales are commendable, and they will go a long way to easing some of this congestion. And anything that we can do, in addition to what I'm talking about tonight about long-term policy, to increase the productivity of our transport networks should be supported. And that's why we at Transurban support the New South Wales Government's long-term transport plan and obviously the capital recycling program. And certainly Melbourne will need to spend significantly more money than it's currently forecast to maintain even the current service levels in that city. So it's clear we're growing, that's pretty easy, and we're aging, including me, having been in the industry a long time. I look at my original pictures in Deutsche, and anyway, quite old. But, and this is putting huge demands on the government purse, and we've had the new intergenerational report. But by 2050, spending on health and aged care is expected to increase from a quarter to almost half of the federal budget. And the government then, as they contend with the doubling of the population over age 65. Now, clearly what this is going to mean is other areas of government expenditure will be scrambling for what's remaining of their funds. But at a time when the governments are facing these competing demands, we are beholden to a transport funding model that has its roots in the early 1900s, when customs and excise duty were introduced on fuel to fund the development and maintenance of our networks. There's been some tinkering around the edges. We've had indexation. We've had hypothecation of funds, but fundamentally, we are still working with a transport model that is more than a century old. Now, no disputing at the time it was innovative, given the horse and cart were the major form of transport, and the Model T Ford had not yet arrived in Australia. And so at the time, introducing a tax on fuel showed a considerable degree of foresight. We've been a bit busy since then, though, and we have built 800,000 kilometers of roads, and the number of vehicles registered has risen by more than 350,000%. And if you look at the last 10 years, our national vehicle fleet has grown nearly 30%, and at this rate, we're looking at nearly 23 million vehicles by 2025. But if we look to the other infrastructure assets, and most of you are represented in this room, and mainly being the utilities, it's clear that in this time, their funding models have undergone wholesale change in response to shifting needs and demands. There are numerous examples in other sectors, ranging from telecommunications, water, electricity, where the pricing models have been revised to better meet the demands of users and drive efficiency. As we all know, here the user pays for what they use and when they use it, and they are importantly incentivized for more efficient behaviors. And of course, this is yet to be tackled in any meaningful way in transport infrastructure. Now today, we're spending more on roads and it far outstrips what we're raising from road-related taxes. So in 2013, the government and the private sector spent approximately $25 billion building new and maintaining existing roads, while road-related taxes and charges raised about $18 billion in funding, which is approximately about a $7 billion shortfall. And on a vehicle kilometer traveled basis, the federal government is raising less revenue than it did 15 years ago. We are driving more kilometers, but we're using less fuel to do it. Now, I don't want to misinterpret issues here. That is a fantastic thing for the environment, but it is disastrous when your whole basis of the funding model is fuel excise. So the end result is that over that period, the fuel excise has gone from raising 4.6 cents to a kilometer down to 3.8. Now, when the government reintroduced CPI indexation on fuel, we're looking at raising an additional $600 million a year. So clearly, that figure is not going to come close to our funding gap, and that gap's growing. So what have the states had to do? Well, in turn, they're lifting their fixed charges on stamp duty, registrations, and licenses to create extra funding for their own infrastructure needs. And over the past 15 years, revenue from stamp duty and driver's license has doubled, while revenue on vehicle registrations has increased by 126%. But to make up for the current shortfall in funding, registration alone would need to be increased by nearly $375 a vehicle in Australia. So I think hopefully it's clear that this is a funding system that has not only outlived its usefulness, it is not transparent. I'm going to talk about something now, it's inherently unfair. Because what is the relationship between the service cost and the provision? What is the relationship between who uses the road and their contribution to the funding? And really importantly, what is technology going to do the fundamental economics over this next decade? And I'm going to put myself out there and give you a personal example of what illustrates our challenge. So in my case, apart from cost of driving on toll roads, which I see tremendous value on, let's just make that clear, I pay very little considering what I use. So in late January, I picked up a new car, and it's what the manufacturer describes as an automobile of tomorrow, and it's an i3 and it's fully electric. So I pay no petrol cost, and therefore there is no contribution to the federal funding pool for road infrastructure. Registration costs me about $300 annually, not including that I get a discount for having an energy-efficient car. And my driver's license fee is about $170 for 5 years, which brings my total contribution to $330 a year, despite me using the roads almost every day, and I can drive unlimited kilometers for that amount. Now, I bought that car because I'm an electrical engineer, and I'm geeky about all the technology, and I can get my phone, can talk to my car, and that's all cool. But the outcome is that one less driver is contributing to the current funding model, and a stark illustration of a system failing and failing fairly fastly. So I'm paying nothing towards fuel excise, but if I was driving a current model petrol car, I'd be contributing just under $400 in fuel excise a year in addition to license and rego. Again, highlighting the fairness of our system, if I was driving a 1990 sedan, which would be far less fuel efficient, I'd be contributing around $800 in fuel excise based on the same number of kilometers a year. So I'm contributing $330 a year, and a 1990 sedan driver is contributing more than $1,100 a year. So that is more than 3 times for driving the same distance. So again, I come back, it's fantastic to see that our vehicles are becoming far more fuel efficient and better for the environment. But clearly there are questions of fairness and equity under this current funding model. Because it's the motorists who cannot afford to buy the latest model car that is paying the most. And on top of that, there is a question of how this model can possibly sustain itself as we increasingly shift to greater fuel efficiency. Because the average age vehicle in Australia is 10 years. So for every 20-year-old sedan we take off the road and replace with a later model car, we can lose approximately $350 of fuel excise per annum. So we need a funding system that's not only fair and sustainable, but we believe built on a principle where those who benefit pay. And now a system such as this lessens the pressures and, importantly, the politics from scarcity of funding and allows us to plan ahead for the next half a century. Furthermore, it will encourage the efficient use of infrastructure, and if we encourage the efficient use of infrastructure, it will lessen the long-term investment burden. So what has been stopping us? Look, it's fairly clear that politicians won't support greater alignment to user pays because they anticipate it will create a community backlash, and we can understand that. And I've had many politicians acknowledge the need to reform the system, but when the discussion turns to introducing such a system, there can be a lot of silence in the room. Just last year, in response to the Productivities Commission inquiry into infrastructure, which Peter's here, and thank you for your contribution, Peter, the federal government acknowledged the sound economic rationale for wider application of user charging, but rejected the Commission's recommendation. Its response was complex issues needed to be worked through before user charging could be implemented as proposed by the Commission. So some would say, as Sir Humphrey from Yes Minter would proudly say, this requires a courageous decision. But I can understand that, because I agree there are many and complex issues. But the issue is, where do Australians actually stand, and is a backlash inevitable? In the independent research that was done, actually twice as many respondents favored a user-pay system for funding road infrastructure rather than a flat fee arrangement. Twice as many respondents said that the user-pay system is fair for all motorists, again, rather than a flat fee. And 4 times as many Australians favored a user-pays model to fund new infrastructure rather than increasing license fees or higher petrol cost. So if we go by these results, it appears the majority of drivers are willing to pay their fair share, and they want others to do the same, especially if it improves their quality of life. Now, when I first arrived in Australia, as Jeff said, and I'm still working on the accent, so apologies there, more than 20 years ago, I came across a paper by Hugh Mackay, where he talked and argued about that Australians seem perfectly willing to accept the theory of user pays, provided it was based on the principle of fairness. But there is a wide gap between user pays in theory and user pays in practice, because Australians were cynical about the government's motives behind such a system and dubious about the relationship between the service and the charge. Australians were concerned that a user pay system would not be based on fairness, rather than it was a sign of governments in financial difficulty looking to raise revenue. Unfortunately, today, it doesn't look like a whole lot has changed, and there's still an underlying distrust of reform in relation to the government agenda. And I agree that we can expect a backlash when the community does not understand the relationship between the service provision and the cost, and importantly, what are the motives for the user pay system? And as I said earlier, we need to talk to Australians, so we need to talk in terms that resonate with Australians and explain why things need to change and what's at risk from our failing system. And again, that is our quality of life, because Australians are making a choice either way about their quality of life. Now, I don't pretend for a moment that this message getting out there will be easy, and Transurban's standing out in front of you today, so it's a bit scary for us, but I and many others in this room talk publicly often about the need and context for some sort of road pricing. But so often my comments are lost in these dramatic headlines, stirring up unthinking responses, which impedes the community's better understanding of complex issues. And I have to spend a lot of time on the phone with the ministers explaining these headlines. Because it's generally the vocal minority derailing the debate. And here I do want to take specific issue with the media and social commentators for acting irresponsible and not presenting a balanced debate, but lazily going to the negative to try and stir emotions. But we need to find a way to encourage a considered and well-informed discussion through the wider community. And again, that comes down to ensuring our message resonates and paves the way for some real conversation. Because even in cities such as Brussels that are plagued with congestion, winning public support has proven a massive hurdle. When plans were announced for a pilot program to look at replacing current road taxes with a user pay system, opponents were quick to rally, and an online petition was reported to have collected 170,000 signatures just in a matter of days. But change can, and it has happened. The GST, obviously, for example, took 15 years to implement from the first discussion of a broad-based consumption tax. And realistically, the reform of the magnitude that we're talking about here tonight is going to take some years to get through. But I read a quote recently attributed to former Reserve Bank Governor Harry Knight, when he said, "You never know when the reform train will arrive at the station, but you need to have your ticket, your bags packed, and be standing on the platform ready for when it turns up." So we must show Australians why they need to consider getting on this reform train. But while we're doing that, there is actually much work to be done to get this reform train rolling. But the time has come for us to look beyond the theory and start taking steps to determine what system might be practical in Australia. Now, we all know of a number of overseas road pricing systems in operation or planning, and they offer components that might be considered as applicable here. For instance, we have Singapore's road pricing system, which is proven to manage congestion, and they're moving toward a real-time dynamic pricing model. Obviously, this effectively prices congestion, and like Transurban's own 495 and 95 express lanes in the US, we raise and lower charges depending on the available capacity of the network. Now, this is a system that Singapore intends to implement across the entire country within the next 5 years. Oregon's road pricing trials offers an example of how to run a comprehensive pilot study by giving participants their choice of technology and the option for privacy. And the philosophy behind Europe's heavy vehicle charging system is about fairness and ensuring those who use the roads pay a fair contribution. And the London congestion charge, we all know, offers a model of transparency around how funds are spent. The London model considers the transportation system holistically, with investing in public transport from the charges that are hypothecated from the congestion zone. Now, if we take the best parts of each of these systems, we start to see what it might be like to produce an effective, fair, and sustainable model. But to truly make progress, we need to trial various systems, engage their effectiveness, and user acceptance. And what we're really proud to do tonight is Transurban is ready to take that next step. So tonight, I'm pleased to announce that Transurban is going to undertake a road pricing study to be conducted in Melbourne over the next year. This is a practical step toward testing road pricing models in the real world. The study, to be launched shortly with a group of volunteer, let's make sure this is volunteer, so we don't want any misquotes again, customers from Melbourne, will trial various user pays model, including a distance-based per kilometer charge. We'll also look at an annual fixed cost based on estimated travel distance, and a price trip or an access charge to the network. We'll also explore some derivations such as time of day pricing and charge for entering the CBD. So we'll have participants' normal driving patterns recorded and then their driving patterns under the nominated scheme. They will be incentivized according to their behavior, but there will be no downside for the volunteers. Now, we're funding this study so that we can learn more about our customers and our networks. And our findings will compare the impact of these models on the existing funding sources that we're dealing with, and evaluate the driver's preference toward these schemes, as well as their attitudes toward using the networks more efficiently. And I think that's the big issue there, is it's about getting their preference and their attitudes. We can all do the theory through modeling, but getting their attitudes and preferences so we know what would be acceptable in the context of the public. Again, I want to make this perfectly clear so we don't get another wrong headline. This is an information gathering exercise only and will have no impact on the current charging funding arrangements for the existing roads, whether they're ours or the network broadly. Now, the study is, again, about collecting data and preferences, and we want to start the conversation. And let's make it really clear, we don't have the answers. So Transurban doesn't know exactly what model is going to work or what the model should be, because we have to engage the community. We have to get them to accept the model needs to change and see what they would accept as a model. But we look forward to sharing these results over the coming year, and we expect they will make a valuable contribution and provide some tangible data points to progressing options for a sustainable funding model. Now, the cynics in the room might question, what's in it for Transurban? I'll make it perfectly clear. Transurban security holders and our employees are 100% aligned in improving the livability of the cities where we operate. Firstly, we want our cities to be the best in the world for ourselves and our families. Secondly, the more productive and efficient these transport networks are, the more valuable our assets become. We are a road company. We are not a car park company. So to coincide with tonight's oration, we've released a paper, Road Pricing, Turning Theory into Practice, which gives details, more details about the study and the various schemes that we'll be testing. And this paper will be available on our website. Now, one of the issues that the paper also looks is the role that technology plays in the implementation of road pricing and efficient networks. And there have been tremendous advances in technology and analytics over the last few years. And the pace is only accelerating, as everyone knows, with every other industry. So along with the study in Melbourne, we've also formed a working group with leading global companies to explore the technology and data analytics that would be critical advancing transport network management and road user interfaces. So Transurban is going to be working with telecommunications company Singtel Optus, navigation, map, and traffic service provider TomTom, and analytics software specialist Quantum IT and SQL Stream, which they currently provide the real-time telematics platform in New South Wales. And they're actually here supporting us tonight. So thank you guys for coming. We're on the table. There we are. Thank you for coming tonight. So we'll combine our expertise and resources to advance the application of emerging technology to transport networks and our customers. We're also partnering with other partners, including network developer and manufacturer Cisco around networking technologies. And along with this partnership in the US, we're joining with Virginia Tech and the Virginia government in the US in applying for a research grant to develop a regional pilot program of connected vehicles, systems, and applications. So this is all the cool stuff, automated vehicles running on our roads, so we're really excited about that. But the Federal Department of Transportation is sponsoring this grant, and they recognize the potential technology has to transform transport networks. And technology has been one of the wider barriers to a user-based system, but now we have a host of opportunities in converging vehicle, roadside, and customer services. And we believe we're reaching a point where smart transport networks are becoming a reality, and we look forward to working with our partners to investigate how this advancing technology can be applied in the transport network management space. So bear with me, we're just about done. One more slide. But I want to end where I began and remind you of the magnitude of the issue that we have discussed tonight. Because reforming our transport funding model is no longer something we believe we can talk about in theory. The system is broken and it is inherently unfair. And if we continue down this path, Melbourne, with a population of almost 8 million in 2050, will be looking at congestion levels of more than 60%. That means drivers can be expected to be sitting in traffic in Melbourne for, on average, more than 120 hours a year. And in Sydney, we'd be facing a congestion rating of around 75%, and that makes Sydney the most congested city on this chart. Or we can choose a fair and sustainable system that will allow us to invest and use the infrastructure more efficiently, so we can shift the dial on congestion and ensure our cities really are the most livable in the world. Now, no question this reform is not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight, but we at Transurban and our partners are taking some of the first steps, and we would like to collaborate and further partner with everyone in this room and the governments to get the reform train moving out of the station. And I am optimistic, and Mark Birrell has taught me to be optimistic. Thank you, Mark. That if we get the right message out and the opportunity to connect with Australians, we can ensure that our quality of life will continue through better transport. Thank you very much.